l'simcha. So for those who are wondering what that's all about, in Judaism we have greetings for everything, and on Shabbat it's Shabbat Shalom or Good Shabbos. On holiday, those parts of the holiday that are Shabbat-like in the sense of the restrictions of Shabbat and Chag, those you would say Chag Sameach. But in these intermediary days, the Chol HaMoed days between the two bookend Chag days of Pesach, and also we do the same thing for Sukkot, the traditional greeting is Moadim l'simcha. Moadim is plural of Moed, as in Chol HaMoed. Simcha is joy. So may your holidays be for joy. And then to make it even more complicated, the response is not Moadim l'simcha. If I say Moadim l'simcha, the response is Chagim uzmanim l'sason, which means holidays and times for joy. And these words actually appear in the Kiddush. So I'll type this in the chat. So in case you bump into anyone in the next day and a half before Chag and you want to say something aside from Happy Passover, Moadim l'simcha is the greeting that you initiate, and Chagim uzmanim l'sason is the response. Okay. All right, so today we are going to continue our journey about Jewish spirituality and the Jewish experience of God. We've been spending a lot of time on God and on different images of God in the Torah, in Tefillot, throughout the Tanakh, not just the 5 books of the Torah. And today we're going to shift focus a little bit because I'm going to have more of a topical focus, which is the spiritual aspects of Jewish food. So I do need to bridge what we did last month to what we're doing today, for those of you who weren't here, as well as for those who were here. But let me first share with you something that Ivan Sokolov shared with me. Okay, just to get you in the mood for food. Okay, so anybody know where this photo was taken and when it was taken? Ivan, do you want to identify? You got to unmute.
It was taken on the last trip to Israel in the Shuk in Tel Aviv.
Okay, so I mislabeled it because I wrote Shuk in Jerusalem, and I realized as I typed it, it didn't look like the Shuk in Jerusalem. It didn't look crowded enough, and the people don't look from enough. So yes, it's the Shuk in Tel Aviv. So thanks for sharing that. I just want to get you all into the mood of Israel and the mood of food. And now we'll do the background, and we'll launch into the food issues. So last class, we talked about mitzvot, mitzvah being the building block of Jewish spirituality. And so I presented various different schemes, some categorization schemes of mitzvot. For example, we can take the 613 mitzvot and divide them into the do's and the don'ts, the aseh and the lo ta'aseh. An example of a do would be eat matzah at your Seder and say the appropriate blessings. Lo ta'aseh would be don't eat chametz, because that's one category. Another categorization scheme is mitzvot ben adam l'chaveiro and mitzvot ben adam l'makom. Mitzvot that are ethical, interpersonal in nature versus those that are ritual. They're between God and people. So, and sometimes there's overlap between them, and some mitzvot do fit into both categories. Does anyone want to give me an example of a mitzvah ben adam l'chaveiro, ethical interpersonal mitzvah between one man and his friend or her friend? Elaine?
Maybe visiting someone while they're sitting Shiva.
Yes, so nichum avelim, comforting mourners during Shiva. That is a mitzvah ben adam l'chaveiro. And an example of a mitzvah ben adam l'makom, a ritual mitzvah, not actually ritual, but religious mitzvah that is between a person and God. Any examples of that come to mind? Risa?
Tefillot, the service of God.
Yes, so tefillah in general, specific tefillot, those are all ethical, those are religious mitzvot between a person and God. I'm going to share the screen now with some of the other categorization schemes. See where food fits into this soon. So I have the do's and the don'ts, the aseh and lo ta'aseh. They're sometimes referred to also as positive and negative commandments. And then we just did the orange section here, the mitzvot ben adam l'chaviro, mitzvot ben adam l'makom. There's also mitzvot that are done at home and those that are generally associated with synagogue. This year, because of the pandemic, many of the rituals and activities that we were used to doing in the synagogue, many of them have been moved to home, but we beforehand were associating them very much with synagogue. And some of them can only be done in synagogues, such as Torah reading. Certain things can only be done in a minyan. But there's many rituals that not only is it okay to do them at home, but they're intended to be done at home. Whether we're talking about affixing a mezuzah on your doorpost or keeping kosher or anything involving the home, lighting candles. Category 4, yet another way to think about the mitzvot, this mitzvah as the building block of Jewish spirituality. We have certain elements of our religious practice that can be done by an individual, prayer, for example, unless certain prayers have to be done by a community. Then there are certain mitzvot, as I said, Torah reading can only be done in a community. Certain mitzvot can be done individually. We certainly are not a religion of sitting on top of a mountain and meditating by ourselves if that's the only choice we have. If we're at the very beginning of the pandemic, when many of us were alone, there were certain things that had to be adapted to an individual context, but were not necessarily intended for that. Then there are these other categories of mitzvot, more reasons for doing the mitzvot that I went over at the end of the last class. This is taken from Prager and Telushkin's book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. And they conceptualize the mitzvot as being either reflexive, ethical, holiness as in promoting the elevation of our activities to a holy level, and historical, national. And they also make the case that certain mitzvot fit into all of these categories. So an example of a historical national mitzvah would be we celebrate Passover by eating maror, bitter herbs, at the Seder because that commemorates the bitterness in Egypt when we were enslaved. And then we eat matzah as a symbol of our freedom because the matzah was made when we were in a rush on our way out of Egypt and the dough did not have a chance to rise. So that would be an example of a historical national mitzvah. A holiness mitzvah would be anything that we do that elevates what we do to a holier extent, whether it is Shabbat, making time holy, or other types of mitzvot that specifically even have a bracha formula before it that says Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav. Kiddishanu, we're saying God who consecrates us by giving us this mitzvah. And any of the mitzvot that are prefaced by that blessing generally fit into this category of holiness. Ethical, any of the mitzvot of ethical, including what Elaine mentioned earlier about visiting people during Shiva, Nichum Avelim, comforting mourners, giving tzedakah, etc. And reflexive are mitzvot that when we do them, they not only affect the outside world or another person, they affect us as well. And I'll go back to Risa's example of tefillah, tefillot, prayers. When we pray, it's not just something that we're hoping to happen out there. Whether or not the prayers affect the outside world, the prayers do affect us. During the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah that is said on weekdays, there's a whole section of requests, and by verbalizing them in the context of the Amidah, we are essentially saying, these are values that I aspire to. These are things that I would like to incorporate into my life. These are important Jewish values. And so in some way, in many ways, the saying of the prayers is reflexive. It's supposed to affect ourselves. The last category that I didn't get to is category 6, is how frequently the mitzvot are done. Is it a mitzvah that's done every day, once a week, once a year, or once or a couple of times during the course of a life cycle? So here's a bigger font version of this. So let's take some examples of this. Okay, we'll go from the broadest one, the least frequent. A life cycle mitzvah, an example of a life cycle mitzvah is a wedding.
A bris.
A bris, excellent. Okay, anybody else want to give me another life cycle mitzvah?
Bar mitzvah.
Burying the dead.
All of that. Yeah, all of that. So from cradle to grave and everything in between, those are life cycle mitzvot. Annual mitzvot, there are mitzvot that are done every year. And an example of that would be any of the holidays. And specifically now, the counting of the Omer. We're in this 49-day counting period between Pesach and Shavuot, between the physical liberation of our ancestors from slavery to the day Shavuot, where we mark our spiritual liberation by receiving the 10 Commandments and the rest of the Torah. So not only is Pesach and Shavuot considered an annual mitzvah, but the counting of the Omer is also an annual mitzvah. It's a daily mitzvah in the sense that we count it every day during this 49-day period, but we only count today, the 4th day of the Omer is only counted once every year. Give me another example of an annual mitzvah, anyone?
Hanukkah.
Yeah, lighting Hanukkah candles. Excellent. Okay, so now a weekly mitzvah. So in addition to things that happen only once a year or once or multiple times during a life cycle, but once for each person's life cycle for most of the life cycle events, weekly mitzvot. What is a mitzvah that occurs about once a week?
Weekly candles, lighting the candles weekly.
Yeah, Barbara. So anything that's relating to Shabbat, so we're lighting Shabbat candles, saying the Kiddush for Shabbat, all of those are weekly mitzvot. And daily mitzvot, what would be an example of a daily mitzvah?
Saying brachas after meals.
Yep, so saying blessings after meals, exactly, right? So assuming that you eat every day, except for maybe some days, there's the tradition of thanking God for your food and saying the foods you say, their blessings you say before and after. Yes, any other daily mitzvot? And we'll go back to your answer, Risa, which keeps coming up as an answer to something.
Asher Yatzar, if one does that, when you wake up in the morning, you're supposed to say blessings.
Yep. So there's the blessing when getting up out of bed in the morning is Modeh Ani, and then anytime you go to the bathroom, it's Asher Yatzar Hadam b'Chokhmah v'Ravo Nekavim Chalim Chalim. We're thanking God for making holes and orifices in our bodies to enable us to do our business, essentially, because once any of these orifices are clogged up or open up too much, we would not be able to stand here and thank you, God. We couldn't even exist, God, without this. So even these very mundane acts that's considered a daily mitzvah. And it's not a mitzvah to go to the bathroom, but if you do go to the bathroom, to say this blessing. Although sometimes. So I just wanted to give you this conception to show you a couple of things. First of all, sometimes we have situations where two mitzvot are happening at the same time, or like one mitzvah is kind of covering two situations, and one is more frequent and one is less frequent. You generally do the more frequent mitzvah first. So, for example, when lighting Shabbat candles, and it also happens to be a holiday, like this coming Friday night, you do say Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat. You also say Lahadlik Ner Shel Yom Tov. But since Shabbat is something that comes once a week, whereas the holiday, this particular holiday, comes only once a year, and other holidays, they're somewhere in between weekly and annual, you say the more frequent one first. So you say Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat V'Shel Yom Tov. And that's the general rule of thumb here. Okay, so now with food mitzvot, where do food mitzvot fit into this scheme? Daily, weekly, annual, or life cycle?
Daily.
All of it.
Well, okay, all of it.
Okay. Well, all of it in the sense that, yeah, there are certain mitzvot that are food related that may only pertain to a life cycle event, perhaps, like, the big challah maybe at the bar mitzvah, but that's still just the same old mitzvah as any kind of bread. But yeah, a lot of the food mitzvot are daily mitzvot. They do appear with certain variations, perhaps on weekly and annual and life cycle. For example, keeping kosher it's a daily mitzvah, but annually it's done in a very different way, or a much more intense way during Pesach, when we eliminate chametz from our diets and are much more punctilious about some of the other observances that have to do with mixing anything that is a grain product with our other foods. Okay, so now we'll get into the meat, so to speak, of this. Let me see if I want to share anything with you yet. Okay, before I share anything with you on the screen, I want to read to you from a book that I've quoted a couple of times before. It's called Embracing Judaism as a Spiritual Practice A Book of Life by Michael Strassfeld. And the whole premise of his book, he repeats this premise in many different shapes and forms. When we first started discussing the spirituality, the word spirituality and what it means, I took something from his book. He talks a lot about heightening our awareness of our surroundings, heightening our awareness of God, heightening our awareness of God's presence in our lives. And that all of that is what makes some of the Jewish things that we do, that is what makes them into a spiritual practice. So I'm going to read to you from his chapter entitled Eating and Food. Rabbi Strassfeld writes, before he writes, he quotes a book called The Darkei Tzedek. And Darkei Tzedek, the quote is, "The main service of God is through eating. So have I heard from my rabbis, and it is similar to prayer." Another quote, this is from Avraham of Slonim in a work called Torat Avot. "Contrary to what one might think, it is possible sometimes to come closer to God when you are involved in material activities like eating and drinking than when you are involved with so-called religious activities like Torah study and prayer. Because when the heart opens up due to the sense of pleasure and there is a feeling of satisfaction and happiness, then is the fit time to come close to holiness." And now, quoting Rabbi Strassfeld, "As we go through our day, we eat. Our relationship to food is a basic aspect of our lives. The ability to obtain enough food has no doubt become a given. For much of the world today, though, this is not true. Nor was it always true for our ancestors. Having enough to eat was a constant concern, either because of poverty or because of the whims of nature. A successful harvest, therefore, has generally been a time for rejoicing. In societies lacking our resources and our sophisticated system of food distribution, people are closely connected to the agricultural cycle, whether or not they are farmers, since food is often obtained locally. The success or failure of the local farmers, then, is of immediate concern to everyone living in such a community. But our concern may be the opposite, namely having too much food. For one thing, our society places a high value on appearance, idealizing thin women and men, bombarding us with images of beautiful people. What, when, and how we eat have become subjects of a focus on our bodies that would hardly be understood by our ancestors." So now I am going to share the screen. A few different aspects about the spirituality of food. I put them into three broad categories here. There's what we eat, and that would be the general topic of kashrut, keeping kosher. When we eat, which days on the Jewish calendar year are we focused on feasting? And when are we focused on fasting? Because that too is part of the spirituality of Jewish food. And then a third category, how we eat. We've mentioned the word blessings, brachot, a couple of times so far, but this is part of this general overall category of it's not just what we eat, it's when we eat and how we eat. Okay, before we get to that, get to the next slide. I want to do this one. Okay, what we eat, keeping kosher. I'm not sure why the Hebrew is right on top of the English there, but I'll read the Hebrew and someone else can read the English. This is from Parshat Kedoshim. Kedoshim is the plural of the word kadosh. It's in the book of Vayikra, comes up in next month. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe limor, daber el kol adat b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alehem. Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Hashem Elohechem. Okay, would someone like to read that? Raise your hand or just unmute yourself and start reading. Go ahead, Risa.
And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, "Speak unto all the congregation, the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy."
Okay.
I like the large print.
Yeah, I'm not sure why some of it became big and some stayed small. Nobody knows. You'll never know. So that's a very general rubric for kashrut. Can someone maybe try to unpack it a little more? What about keeping kosher is fitting or befitting this concept of holiness? How does kashrut make eating a holy endeavor? Marilyn.
God said so that it makes it holy. We have a higher power.
Okay, so a piece of it certainly is because God said so, right? Remember the Hebrew National commercials? We answer to a higher authority. Maybe they still have commercials, but who watches commercials anymore?
I'm a little closer, Lynn.
Okay. So I thought I saw somebody else raising.
My brother-in-law would like to say something, but he said, "Come
Oh,
along."
you're all the way in the back there. Okay, go ahead.
Because with kashrut, you don't take it for granted. You're making a very specific choice every time you eat something. And
Okay.
you have to think about it and do
You're
it
aware of it.
and be specifically aware of what you're doing and why.
Right. So we have a lot of this awareness going back to Strassfeld's overall conception here. I'm going to read to you now, not from Rabbi Strassfeld, but read to you from the Prager and Telushkin book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. They're the ones who have those 4 categories of mitzvot. And they put kashrut into all 4 categories. And so, for example, why is kashrut under the category of laws of holiness? They write that the purpose of the laws of holiness is to make our actions and even our time holy. Instead of denying or denigrating our animal-like activities, Judaism attempts to sanctify them through its laws of holiness. To elevate the act of eating, the most frequent of our animal-like activities, Judaism prescribes numerous mitzvot, including, and they list a bunch, but what we eat is a very big piece of what we eat is contributing to this holiness. That every time we are about to eat something, we have a decision to make. What am I going to eat? There is a choice involved with every single meal choice, every single meal activity, whether it's a snack or a full meal. And those choices are holy choices. In the same way how people who are gluten-free have to look up certain ingredients and know not to eat them, right? So, and you've got a whole list of things that you cannot eat, and you know to look for them on the boxes, right? And there are people who are lactose intolerant, and there are people who have nut allergies. There's many things you look for, identifiers on a box. Keeping kosher is the same kind of thing. Even if you're not talking about boxed food, if you're talking about particular foods, there's the category of foods you can eat and the foods that you cannot eat. I'm going to read to you just something that I use with my conversion students when I'm giving them kind of a starting point of if you're going to start keeping kosher, what's kind of a ladder of observance? Like what are some of the things you should not have in the house, things that you should stop keeping in the house? And so you can start by no pig, no shellfish, then add on meat, only meat that's been koshered in a certain way, killed in a certain way, not eat meat, milk and meat together, checking the ingredients of processed foods. All of the above plus 2 sets of dishes for meat and dairy and pots and silverware as well. Then for many, including our synagogue parameters, are to use only food that have kosher supervisions. In some synagogues, in some catering halls, it's only specific kosher certifications and not others. So every food is a choice. And when it comes to eating outside the house, so there are many people who are consistent in Judaism with what they eat inside and outside of the house. So someone like Anne can be gluten-free in the house and not gluten-free outside of the house. So she has to ask the same kind of questions. And if there aren't boxes to be looked at on a shelf, she has to ask the waiter, the chef, what's in these different items. And now, fortunately, a lot of food items are labeled gluten-free, even in a restaurant on a menu. For others, there's a little bit of a distinction of what they do inside and outside. Perhaps it's eating all of the same foods outside that they eat inside, but kind of being a little more lax on the silverware and the plates, etc. There are some people who their category of what they won't eat outside is just, I will not eat pig or shellfish, but will eat other things. So every single eating activity, a snack or a meal, whether you're in a supermarket, a restaurant, wherever, there are choices to be made. And by doing this, this is a way of elevating this everyday act into a holy act. Anybody else want to say anything about this holiness category before we talk about something else relating to kashrut? And I'm specifically talking now, let's hold our comments to be just about what we eat. We are going to move to a different section. Category B of this class is when we eat and when we don't eat. And then the third will be is what we do when we eat, how we eat. So let's focus right now, comments, questions on the what we eat. Anybody have any statements, questions? Marilyn.
Yes, that for yourself and for other people to know you're a Jew when you keep kosher. Friends in Israel taught us this.
Okay, so that's an interesting. So going back to the Prager and Telushkin schema, I'll put that back on the. No, I already took it out. Never mind. No, we'll have to just remember. The 9 questions people ask about Judaism when they talk about kashrut. There's the other categories as well. And so let me just share with you what they say about kashrut and how it fits into this category of national and historical. Okay, so let me read this to you. They say, because it is a public observance, I have to justify it rather frequently to my friends and certainly to myself. I find that whether I like it or not, kashrut brings me into contact with other people who are keeping kosher and with a series of rather important questions. And they go on with that. And then here's here's a reflexive purpose of kashrut in the Prager-Telushkin scheme. Kashrut, like all Jewish laws, serves the crucial purpose of strengthening every Jew's self-control by making these choices, right? Every time a Jew sits down to eat a kosher meal, he is reminded that the animal being eaten is a creature of God, that the death of such a creature cannot be taken lightly, that hunting for sport is forbidden, that we cannot treat any living thing irresponsibly, and that we are responsible for what happens to other beings, humans and animals, even if we did not personally come into contact with them. Okay, any other comments about what we eat or questions about what we eat and the general idea of what the major purposes of kashrut are? Yes, Barbara.
About the hunting.
Okay. Wait, Elaine, give me a moment. Barbara's going to speak first and then you, okay?
Sure.
Although Barbara's unmuted and Barbara's muted and you're unmuted, so maybe we should.
Okay, all right, I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
There's a question about dishwasher. How do you get a dishwasher ready to use for Shabbat? For Passover dishes, and you know, as opposed to the regular dishes, right?
Okay, so there are there's a wide range of opinions about the dishwasher. There are many rabbis who say you cannot kosher a dishwasher. Many. I'd say there's probably more who say you can't than those who say you can. I do kosher my dishwasher. What makes koshering a dishwasher easier to do or more, let's say, justifiable is if you have metal racks inside your dishwasher, because metal is much easier to kosher than other materials. There are certain materials that are not kosherable. Plastic is not kosherable. What you do with a dishwasher, you just run it through a few times at the highest cycle. So it's very similar to like a self-cleaning oven. It's made koshering the ovens much easier. For an oven that's not self-cleaning, it's not enough to just scrub it down. You have to use a blowtorch, but you do not need a blowtorch with a self-cleaning oven.
Right.
Okay. Any other comments? Elaine, you were next.
Yeah, I was questioning the business about hunting. I think you said just for sport is not allowed. I mean, I've known of Jewish people who are hunters and not necessarily, to bring home the bird or the deer or whatever. That's a no-no.
It's a no-no. Yes, I mean it's not always helpful to say I know a Jew who does this, because find me a Jew who does all the mitzvot. I don't think there is such a person out there. myself included, whether we're violating mitzvot intentionally or by accident. Like, there's no one out. So we can very easily point to lots of things that people do. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the law is. Right?
What about fishing?
Fishing is okay if you're fishing for the sake of eating the fish.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? Joanne has a question or a comment.
You mentioned this, the goal is self-control, with the focus being on self.
That's one of the reasons for kashrut, not the only reason. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, but just the whole concept of being responsible for yourself and controlling yourself seems to me to be almost antithetical to so many of the fundamentalist variations in which a woman, for example, has to cover hair and cover body so as not to be attractive to anyone else, whether it's, we're talking about Jewish women or Muslim women. The Asian religions don't seem to deal with that, but the Middle East, the Abrahamic traditions do. It's fascinating.
Right, and it is true. So I'm going to put back on the screen. This may help address your question. The different categories of mitzvot. So I'm pointing now to the Prager and Telushkin. Reflexive is an example, is a category, and there's some mitzvot that do fit into that only, and then there are some mitzvot that fit into multiple categories. So when I was reading the part before about the self-control and kashrut, that would make the reflexive aspect of kashrut. But there are other aspects of kashrut as well. And I'll come back to the food issue in a moment, since that's the focus of the class, but I do want to address your head covering issue. I can't speak for women who are following the who are Muslims, or women who are Christian and covering hair because of other religious traditions. But within Judaism, while yes, there is a big piece of it, which is modesty for the sake of other people not finding you attractive, or other people knowing that you're married and therefore you're off limits. So it's not just about being unattractive, because many of the Jewish head coverings are not unattractive at all. So if that was the purpose, they're certainly not accomplishing that. But for many people who cover their hair, there is a reflexive aspect as well. I have a colleague of mine who used to wear a kippah, does not wear a kippah anymore. She now wears, she got married and decided she was going to cover her hair, but she's a rabbi. And she says for her, it is a way of marking herself, to remind herself every morning, even more so than by looking at her wedding ring or her engagement ring, that she is a married woman. And for her, it symbolizes certain things for herself. And it also signals things for other people as well. So there's the reflexive aspect of it, but there's other pieces such as, she doesn't use this language, but Prager and Telushkin use the language of historical and national, identifying with other people who do the same thing. And she mentions, interestingly, that it not only connects her to other Jewish women who cover their hair, but also when she's on the New York City subway and she sees somebody who is Muslim or Christian, more so Muslim, because Christian head coverings tend to be more like within the context of church service. But when she sees other women covering their hair from other faith traditions, there is kind of a knowing look between them. The way she describes it is that she didn't used to make eye contact with these people, but you're making eye contact with them because you're sharing something now. It seems like you're very different religions, but maybe not so much, and there's something shared. So I think Prager and Telushkin, when they talk about the Jewish mitzvot, they're primarily talking about bonding with other Jews. But I think for certain mitzvot, it goes even beyond that, just bonding. You think about back in the day when you were pregnant, and all of a sudden you noticed all the other pregnant women out there. And they were all there before, or not those specific women, but your eye doesn't really go to those things until you yourself are in that experience. Now, going back to the food issue, Prager and Telushkin, if you have the book, I know many of you took the class with me where we discussed the book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. And if you want to write this down to look up at some other point, on page 58 of their book, they actually have all of the major purposes of kashrut as far as they see it. And they show how they fit into these different categories. So, for example, they say one of the reasons to eat these foods and not these other foods is to limit the number of animals that a Jew is permitted to kill and eat. And by doing that, by having that self-control and making those choices, that puts it into the category, kashrut, into the category of a reflexive mitzvah, one that is doing something to the performer, and also ethical, something that's showing a consciousness of ethics. Then number 2, to render the slaughter of the permitted animals as painless as possible, category of ethical mitzvah. Reason 3, to cause revulsion at the shedding of blood. That is a reflexive aspect of the mitzvah of kashrut as well as an ethical aspect. To help sustain Judaism and the cohesion of the Jewish community. That's a national reason for keeping kosher. And to raise the act of eating from a mundane animal-like level to something holier. There's your holiness category. So that's something to look up if you have the book. Another thing that you might want to look up, I don't know if any of you saved old copies of what used to be known as the Women's League and Sisterhood magazine. It was a hard copy book, I think, a magazine that came out once a month. And this one is from...
It was called Outlook.
This is the one before Outlook. So Outlook was one, it was the version before it, because this one is from spring, summer 2006. And I think shortly thereafter, it became Women's League Outlook. My friend and colleague, Rabbi Paula MacDrill, wrote an article entitled Shmirat Kashrut, the observance of Kashrut. And then her subtitle of the article is Holy Eating. And she says, holiness is the only reason given in the Torah. That was the quote that Risa read earlier. The only reason given in the Torah for the dietary laws. The primary reason for keeping kosher is that God told us to do so. That's what Marilyn said. It's the old why because I said so argument. How do we find meaning today in the idea that following a set of rules about permitted and non-permitted foods will make us holy? What does it mean that we should be holy because God is holy? What is holiness? For conservative Jews, keeping kosher is an obligation. But studies tell us, and this was back in 2006 even, studies tell us that the majority of conservative Jews do not observe kashrut, yet this fact does not diminish the ideal of the movement's theology. Whether or not we accept and observe halakha, Jewish law, conservative Judaism considers us to be commanded in the observance of mitzvot, including kashrut. So she specifically, when she talks about kashrut, it says, okay, here we go. On the surface, we are experiencing the mundane, shopping, preparing, eating food. But by following ancient and treasured rules, we attach meaning to the everyday. We are tying the mundane to the spiritual by placing God awareness into every action. So I'm going to type that phrase into the chat, placing God awareness into our every action. Okay, so, and that's quote is from Rabbi Paula MacDrill. Does anyone want to say anything about that phrase?
Yes.
Or if it resonates with you or does not resonate with you? Yes, Marilyn.
Okay, yes, even the mundane like eating can be made holy because it's not just enjoying the food, but remembering who gave us the food.
It's remembering who gave us the food, and it's being very conscious. I'm sorry to keep picking on you, Anne. It's just that you're very, your box is very close to mine on the screen, and I know that there are certain foods you don't eat. Oftentimes when we think about the don'ts of what we can't do, whether we're talking about Shabbat or holidays or kashrut, it seems like such a downer, but it also it's the way we live our lives for a variety of reasons, even outside of the realm of Judaism. People who watch their weight for various reasons, or trying to fit into a dress before a wedding, or because of health reasons, there are certain foods that they cannot eat because they would get horrible allergic reactions. These are all reasons for making choices. And you may not think of them as holy choices, but in a sense, they really are holy choices. Every time we make a choice, it's holy, and particularly within the realm of kashrut. So go ahead, Anne.
Since you're picking on me, I'll just make a comment. Try or going into a restaurant and trying to order kosher and gluten-free. Don't go together. Or try going on an airplane. Kosher always has flour mixed into it. So they're gluten-free and then there's kosher and they don't go together.
So that makes it
Just
even more complicated. Yeah. But think about how conscious that you have to be for making those choices. I know for certain foods that I just know are kosher and they're not necessarily good for me, but they're there and they're open, like say M&Ms. Like you don't think about it, you just eat, right? But if you're going to shop or if you're in a restaurant or you're someplace where you have to make that conscious choice, there is something there. It's not just about discipline, it's also about making a choice, and that makes that moment holy because it's a moment of pause. And a moment of pause is a moment of awareness. It's a moment of self-awareness, and it's a moment of awareness of God, and it's a moment of awareness that everything you do is a spiritual act or can be a spiritual act if you treat it as such. Okay, so let's move on now to the next category. If you have other questions or comments about kashrut, you can bring them up later as well. But let me just move on. So what we eat is just one of the aspects of the spiritual endeavor of Judaism. This chart, I have to thank my friend and colleague, Rabbi Abby True. I don't think she put this together. She may have found it online, but I got it from her. She had used it once in a presentation, and I asked her to send it to me. So the Jewish calendar we often think of in a linear format or in a calendar format, right? One page after the other. And what I love about this is it's a circle, it's a cycle. And what's highlighted here are not only the moments of when we eat a lot, but also the moments that are commanded for fasting. So I'll show you let me show you the other color coding that's going on here as well. So the blue, everything that's in blue here, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, which is covered with another color, so it's hard to see, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, Passover, Shavuot, those are all biblical holidays. Those are the only biblical holidays. So all the time when people say, but the Torah only says, don't see the kid in its mother's milk. It doesn't say have separate dishes. Yeah, and the Torah also doesn't tell us to observe these rabbinic holidays, Hanukkah and Purim. Right? And the Torah doesn't tell us to observe these Zionist holidays, whether we're talking about Independence Day, Israel Independence Day, or Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. There are these other post-biblical, post-rabbinic holidays, Holocaust Memorial Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, next Wednesday night and Thursday. There also is Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, before Yom HaAtzmaut, Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is earlier in time. It was set on the Jewish calendar before Holocaust Memorial Day and Yom HaZikaron, but also it didn't exist at the beginning of the Mishnah period. It didn't exist certainly in the Bible period. And Rabbi Akiva lived during the rabbinic period, but Lag BaOmer was not something that was put on the calendar until way after Rabbi Akiva. So you can see that there's a whole range here of holidays. The ones that are in green are fast days, and we don't often think of them on the Jewish calendar, and yet they are an important piece of the Jewish spiritual practice relating to eating. It's not just about every day what food choices do I make. It's also about, throughout the course of the year, what are the days where traditionally we're supposed to eat and holidays where we are traditionally supposed to refrain from food. You know, today, one of the hottest things, maybe not among the people on this call, but in certain communities and certainly among one of my daughters and her friends, intermittent fasting is a very big thing. Intermittent fasting generally means in a 24-hour period, there are certain hours they don't eat, and then they eat. And I'm sure it's going to be one of these many fads that will go out just as easily as it came in. But for right now, many people are doing it. I'm not sure how healthy it is. It definitely enables you to lose weight. But we have on the Jewish calendar intermittent fasting as well. It's not intermittent fasting over the course of a 24-hour period, but it's intermittent fasting over the course of the year. And if you look at it, at this Jewish calendar that's on your screen, you can see that the fast days are punctuating the whole year. Now, they may not have been designed that way initially because some of them came as a package, some didn't. So for example, Yom Kippur is a fast day, and that's a biblical fast day. That was the only intermittent fasting we had in biblical times. Then we had, well, biblical when I say Torah times, but Fast of Esther, Ta'anit Esther, well, that came up in the later part of the Tanakh, in Megillat Esther, and then was observed afterwards. Then you have these other fasts that are connected with the destruction of the temple. The 10th of Tevet, the 17th of Tammuz, the 9th of Av. There's also the fast day, Fast of Gedalia, 3rd day of Tishrei. It just happens to be between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but it has nothing to do with those holidays. It's really just commemorating a sad day when a Jew killed another Jew in the course of Jewish history. Gedalia, who was appointed to be a governor over the land that we now call Israel, he was assassinated by one of his own, very reminiscent of what happened with Yitzhak Rabin many years later. So we have here, if you look throughout the calendar, there's just fast and fast and fast. You eat a lot on Sukkot, perhaps Shmini Atzeret, and certainly Simchat Torah as well. That didn't even make the calendar. Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret are one holiday in Israel. Maybe the person who put this together is Israeli, I don't know. So you have a fast here, right in the middle of all these eating holidays. You cook a lot and eat a lot on Rosh Hashanah, cook a lot and eat a lot on Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. But mittens are in, and right in there you have Fast of Gedalia, you have Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, latkes, food, Tu B'Shvat Seder, 10th of Tevet, another intermittent fast right there on the Jewish calendar. Then between your Tu B'Shvat Seder and your Purim, Mishloach Manot, you got another fast there, the Ta'anit Esther, intermittent fast. So, and here we have a whole pileup of food holidays, Passover and Shavuot, and then back again to Rosh Hashanah. And in between there, we have some fast days. So again, I don't think that in the halachic literature, these fast days are considered intermittent fasts, but I think there is some of that sensibility in the Jewish calendar that it's not just about what we eat and what we don't eat, it's also about when we eat. So I'm going to take this off the screen and see if anyone has any questions or comments, either about that diagram or just about the overall concept about when we eat and how Judaism treats when we eat and when we don't eat, and how that can become part of your spiritual practice, how it can be considered to be a spiritual practice. Okay, we're all good. Oh, no, Marlene, did you want to say something? No, I see Marlene's hand. I thought she was raising her hand. Okay, any other comments about the Jewish year, about the fast days, about what the purpose of fasting is? Okay, so I should say, I don't have the book with me, but Rabbi Eliezer Diamond wrote a book on fasting and asceticism, A-S-C-E-T-I, in Jewish tradition. And while there is some kind of like fringe element of asceticism within Judaism, the major purpose, the major focus and function of the fast days on the Jewish holiday is not deprivation in the sense of let's give up the material world. It's that certainly when it comes to Yom Kippur, we're supposed to be focusing more on the spiritual than the material. We're supposed to be focusing on times to pray as opposed to times to eat. But it's, in general, Judaism is not a religion of abstinence. So we can be sad without denying ourselves in a very deep way. And I know that fasting is hard for most of us, so it may feel that way to many of you. Okay, let's go then to the next screen. So I'm on the same screen. So we already talked about what we eat, kashrut, when we eat, feasting and fasting, and how we eat, blessings over food. So I have here's just an example of some. Would anyone like to read what some of these brachot are, starting from the top? Myrna, do you want to read? You can read the English. You don't have to read the middle part. You want to unmute and read what is said for bread?
Bread, who brings forth bread from the earth.
Okay.
Cake, who creates various kinds of foods.
Wine.
Wine creates fruit of the vine. Fruit, who creates fruit of the tree. Vegetable, who creates fruit of the ground. Beverage, that all was made by his word.
Okay, and so I'm going to say them all in Hebrew now. If you could repeat after me, just the middle part. The bracha formula is the same for all blessings. And again, going back to Strassfeld, it's all about heightening your awareness by before I eat this food, just how we make food choices of what food to eat, there's also choices of what blessings to say. So the Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu Melech Haolam goes before all of them, and then you have to stop and think, what am I eating? If it's bread, it's a little more self-evident. It's Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. And before eating bread, it's traditional to pour water 3 times on each hand and say, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim, who sanctified us by his mitzvot and commanded us on washing hands. And these two are not just for Shabbat, although for many people Shabbat's the only time they eat bread, or certainly the only time they eat challah. But you can say Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz on any bread, not just on challah. Cake is Borei Minei Mizonot. It's a little bit more than cake. Does anyone know what else we say Borei Minei Mizonot? What else would fall into that category? Joanne? Oh, you're just scratching your head. That looked like a hand raised to me. Okay, what else might we say Borei Minei Mizonot on? No, it's a very popular one in preschool, or at least it used to be, before everyone became gluten-free. Yeah.
Cookies? Be any kind of refreshment, like any kind of sweet thing?
Yeah, so it's, Risa said cookies. Elaine said refreshment. So it's a refreshment that has grain in it is Borei Minei Mizonot, which is why so many of the Passover gluten-free desserts, including the rainbow cookies, the bracha is not Borei Minei Mizonot. Borei Minei Mizonot would be not only, it doesn't necessarily have to be sweet. It often is, because thinking about snack in preschool, but Mizonot can also be pasta. Mizonot can be, you say Mizonot on rice, even though rice is not a grain. There are certain foods you say Mizonot on, even though they're not sweet. So that they would all fall into Borei Minei Mizonot. There's also a blessing on wine, and in addition to wine, there's also grape juice, Borei Pri Hagafen. I think it was Murray who asked this question once on one of my classes. He thought, why don't we say Borei Pri Hagafen or Geffen on grapes, since those are fruit of the vine. For whatever reason, back in the days of the Talmud, there was a distinction made with beverages, that beverages would have a different blessing. And if it's a blessing, if it's a beverage that is not made of grape products, it's shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro. But if it's a blessing that is made of grape products, it's Borei Pri Hagafen or Geffen. Geffen and Gafen is the same word. Geffen is the actual word for a vine, and Gafen is the pronunciation of the word Geffen when it appears at the end of a clause or a sentence in this case. Okay, Borei Pri Ha'etz and Borei Pri Adama. So when would we say, when is it appropriate? When does Judaism like us to say Borei Pri Ha'etz?
You're having a piece of fruit.
Yeah, but and what constitutes a fruit in Jewish land?
That which grows off a tree.
Yeah, so it has to be something that comes from a tree, but interestingly, a tree that, I forget what the word for it is, I'm blanking it. I want to say deciduous, a tree that doesn't die in the winter. They're just the leaves fall off, the leaves die, but the tree remains. So an apple tree is a good example of that. Right. So the tree is always there, the apple's not always there, but when we say a blessing before eating a fruit, we say Borei Pri Ha'etz. Whereas something like a pineapple or a banana, those...
A tomato.
Right, they completely, right, those are, and tomatoes, they completely shrivel up and die, or they have to regenerate themselves. The tree itself has to regenerate itself, not just the fruit. So on those, instead of saying Borei Pri Ha'etz, who creates fruit of the tree, we say Borei Pri Ha'adama, who creates fruit of the ground. Now, it might seem a little, you know what the word is, picayune, like what difference does it make? Does God really care what blessing we're saying? And again, I certainly can't get into God's head and don't believe God has a head. That's a little too anthropomorphic for me. But the idea of making choices before you eat, it comes back to this, just how we make choices on what we eat. Judaism encourages us to make choices on what to do before we eat. How do we eat? What's the context in which we eat? What do we say before we eat? And with that brief pause of having to think about this fruit that I'm about to eat, does it come from this kind of tree or that kind of tree? This food that I'm going to eat, does it have grain in it or does it not have grain in it? That's where you pause and decide which blessing you're going to say. So it's very much the decision-making process, the pause, the heightening awareness that makes this a spiritual practice as much as getting the blessing right, so to speak. Now, what about that last blessing? I
have a question, Rabbi. I have a question. What if you have a plate that has a grain on it, a vegetable on it, maybe a piece of matzah or maybe a meat? Which blessing do you say? Do you have to say all of them?
That is an excellent question. It actually was asked at my rabbinical school interview, believe it or not.
Oh, really? I might be ordained for asking the question.
Yeah. No, they asked me this question, and of course I gave the classic, it depends. No, the question wasn't exactly that. It was, what kind of blessing do you make on a fruit salad? So my answer was, it depends, meaning it depends which fruit are in the fruit salad. But yours goes one step further and looks at the whole plate. So oftentimes when we have a meal that has lots of stuff on it, if it has bread, in Jewish tradition, the spiritual practice of Judaism has determined that bread constitutes a meal that requires only one blessing. And that blessing is hamotzi lecha min haaretz. So if you have bread with everything else, you wash your hands, you say the blessing hamotzi, and it covers everything else. And then part of that package is that after the meal is over, birkat hamazon. So that's if you have bread. If you don't have bread, then you do say blessings over each of the different foods that are there. And sometimes the way you decide which one you're going to say it on, it depends on which is ikar and which is tafel. Ikar means which is the main part of your meal. What are you considering to be the main part versus the parts that are more like sides? So for example, cereal and milk. For most people, not all, I know some notable exceptions. Most people who eat cereal, it's about the cereal and the milk is just a delivery system for the cereal. So you say the blessing on the cereal and then or you say the blessing on the milk, or some say you don't even have to say the blessing on the milk. Most people do say the blessing on the milk, but they say it afterwards. The order is the main thing you're eating and then what's considered secondary. And of course makes it very confusing for things like tortilla chips dipped in.
I'll raise my hand for you because you may not
salsa, right? Because like, for many people, the chip is the delivery system for the salsa and not the other way around. Risa, you wanted to say so. I don't see your...
my brother-in-law does.
Yeah,
okay, there you go. You're in the back, so I didn't see your hand.
I was taught that if you had more than one thing but no bread at the meal, you could say shakol nehiyeh bevaro, and that would account for all of the other things as well, since it does say everything is included.
Yeah, so it is true that as I put this back on the screen to add to your comment, that comment, the blessing, shahakol nehiyeh bevaro, is definitely more general than borei mizonot, borei pri hagafen, borei pri ha'etz, borei pri ha'adamah. And borei pri ha'adamah, the ground, is a more general one than ha'etz. So there are people who will say shakol nehiyeh bevaro. It's not the common tradition to do that. It's much more considered more praiseworthy to say more blessings if you can. Although hamotzi, you're only saying one blessing, you're not really saying only one blessing because you're also saying the hand washing blessing. Then you're saying the birkat hamazon, which has multiple times that you say Baruch atah Hashem. There is this idea, it's not a halacha, but it's a very strong minhag that you want to strive to say 100 blessings a day. So you're not looking to get away with fewer blessings. You really actually want to be adding blessings. The shakol nehiyeh bevaro, if I were having something, so like the example, the cereal and the milk, definitely you would say mizonot, and you can say shakol on the milk as well. I wouldn't say shakol and cover the whole thing. Maybe there are some people who follow that. Like I said, let's not forget why we're doing this. It's not so important. Like the bottom line is, if you quote unquote make a mistake, if you said shahakol on your cereal and didn't say it on the mizonot, it doesn't make you a sinner, right? It doesn't make you a bad person or a bad Jew even. But there are the preferred rules, and the rules are part of this system, and the system is a way of heightening awareness. And if we know that we're always only going to be able to say Shakol Niyeh B'Dvaro, we might never say some of these other things, because almost every food we eat has some Shakol in it. Because even if you're eating a meal, you've got water with it, and water is Shakol Niyeh B'Dvaro. And I don't know anyone who says you just say Shakol Niyeh B'Dvaro on the water, and that covers your meal. But you are right, Len, that it is the most general of the blessings. And in fact, if you're in doubt about something and you don't know what to say, so I have these kosher for Passover, gluten-free rainbow cookies, and I don't know what they are. I assume they're not mizonot. They most likely are Shakol Niyeh B'Dvaro. Sometimes the package will say it on it, sometimes not. But my just pausing to ask myself that question, that in and of itself makes what I do, what I say, and what I eat, and the whole eating experience into a spiritual practice, as opposed to just rote. And in fact, I would dare say, going one step further, those who say blessings by rote and just mumble them and are not pausing and are just doing it because you have to, are also missing the point and are getting the letter of the law but missing the spirit of the law. Okay, any comments about blessings, why we say blessings, those particular blessings about food? Wanted to make a few more comments about food, and they say something about other blessings as well. So the one thing I wanted to say about blessings, well, I guess I'll hold off because that's a blessings in general comment. Let me read to you something else. And again, I highly recommend this book, this Embracing Judaism as a Spiritual Practice, a Book of Life, the chapter on eating and food. This is another aspect of the spiritual aspect of food. Food plays many roles in the stories of the Torah. Abraham and Sarah employ food as an expression of hospitality. Jacob uses a pot of lentils to buy the birthright from his hungry brother, Esau. Food is central to the plot of the Joseph story, because it is food that brings Joseph to power and brings his brothers to Egypt during a time of famine. When Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, breaking bread together is depicted as a social setting. The stories of the patriarchs are filled with feasts and famines. So we have food not only punctuating our lives and our daily spiritual practice, but also the general, a bigger mitzvah, the mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, inviting guests into our home, something that many of us have not been able to do for a very long time, but God willing, we'll be able to do soon enough. This also is part of the expression of food as a spiritual practice, because we're not just inviting people into our homes, we're inviting people into our homes to eat. And there is something about the eating. I especially love when there's a potluck aspect to a meal. In my house, certainly will allow people to bring food to my house if they keep a kosher house. And there's something really nice about people bringing over food and sharing their recipes, is they're giving a part of themselves, and that then makes the whole meal a spiritual practice. Elaine, I still remember your the broccoli with the onion, the onion mix.
It was cauliflower.
Was it cauliflower?
Yeah, it was cauliflower.
Okay, so I remembered it incorrectly. Okay, so it was an incorrect spiritual experience for me, but it's still a spiritual experience. In my head, it was broccoli. It still has broccoli in my head. I happen to love cauliflower. It was delicious, whatever it was. Well, it was an onion soup, right? It was like a Goodman's onion soup.
You're muted, Elaine.
Yeah, you're muted.
It was cauliflower with some onions, with some teriyaki, and I forget already what it was. But it was roasted cauliflower with the seasonings.
Well, it was delicious. Okay, so that, and of course there is Mark Levine's famous cakes, right? It's a spiritual experience. I hope it's a spiritual experience for you making those cakes as well as it is for you delivering them to people on specific holidays, or making them for other people, and also the eating of them. You know, people joke around sometimes and say, I wish and think there should be a bracha for chocolate. There isn't a special bracha for chocolate. That seems to me like a sin. I don't know, right? I say Shakol Niyeh B'Dvaro on chocolate, but every time before I eat a piece of chocolate, I say there really should be a special blessing for this, because it really elevates this. This experience is really pleasurable on a physical aspect, but also in a really spiritual way as well. So I think oftentimes when we hear the term spiritual practice, we think of yoga and meditation and all of these other things, which are spiritual practices. But we have so much within our own tradition that we often forget to imbue these day-to-day activities with spiritual significance. So let me wrap up the food piece shortly.
Rabbi, may I just ask a question, please? I missed part of your presentation because I had an important call that came through about scheduling some appointments. What about meat or fowl or the protein part of the meal?
Okay, so most proteins are shahakol nihiya bidvaro. So I'm actually going to put on the screen here. Where is my thing? Here we go. Right. So blessings over all foods that do not come from the earth, from a tree, from a vine, from anything. And that includes water. And I will say includes eggs. It includes meat. It includes beef, chicken, etc. It's this blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nihiya bidvaro. King of the universe, by whose word all things came to be. There also is a blessing afterwards. We oftentimes think only of the blessing before, but there are blessings afterwards as well. I mentioned Birkat Hamazon as something that you say after a meal, including bread. But if you have any of the other foods, there are some exceptions, but most of the foods after eating cold cuts or cheese or eggs or a piece of chicken, chicken soup, whatever, this is the blessing that you say. It's Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam boreh nefashot rabot v'chesronan al kol ma shebaratza lahachayot behem nefesh kol chai Baruch chai ha'olami. Will someone read that for me in English? Phyllis, will you read it? The English, blessed are you, Lord our God.
Yes. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of numerous living beings and their needs, for all the things you have created with which to sustain the soul of the living being. You're in the way here. Blessed is the life of the world's all time.
Okay, yeah. So that's a one size fits most blessing for after. There are certain exceptions. Does anyone know what the exceptions are for, in addition to something that you might say after a meal that's not Birkat Hamazon, which is the whole shebang, the long blessing that you say with a meal, after a meal with bread or matzah, by the way. Then there's the Boreh Nefashot one, which is for the shahakol type foods, all of those proteins. There's another kind of blessing called al hamichya, and there's another one called, well, it's oftentimes called bracha acharona, the after blessing. Does anyone know what those blessings are for? When might say, and I'll give you a hint, is that we had one at the Passover Seder. Risa?
I think after wine.
Yeah, after wine. So at the Passover Seder, you don't need to say a blessing after every single cup of wine, but after the last cup of wine, which happens to be after we've already done Birkat Hamazon, there is a bracha acharona and an after blessing that's short. It's about a paragraph, and it ends with the word. It includes the words al hagefen be'al pri hagefen, and for the vine and for the fruit of the vine. There's a similar blessing called al hamichya for foods on which you say mizonot. So if the blessing before is borei mimnei mizonot, let's say I'm having pasta, or I'm having all the things that Anshin can't eat, all of the cereal, whatnot. After you say eat any kind of food that required a mizonot before the meal, after the meal, what the bracha is al hamichya. And it's a couple of paragraphs long, very similar to the one that's in the Haggadah after the wine. So again, the whole purpose of these blessings is to heighten our awareness. And speaking of heightening our awareness, let me get this. I wanted to end today not with food, but let's see if I can find it. There we go. Okay, so we had all these food blessings. And by the way, they're in the weekday Siddur. So if you have the Sim Shalom weekday Siddur, the weekday blessings are page 228, 229, etc. And they have the blessing after the meals. I didn't do the whole Birkat Hamazon. I think I just did first page. Yep. But in that same section of the Siddur, just bringing the food spiritual experience to the general idea of heightening awareness, and every moment of our life, perhaps, being part of our spiritual practice. In this very same section of the Siddur, the title heading here is Brachot of Gratitude. In Hebrew, it's not a great translation. Brachot HaNehenim means blessings of pleasure, things that give you pleasure, and then you express gratitude after eating them. In that same section of the Siddur, before all of the food blessings, there's a whole section here starting on page 222. Okay, and I'm going to make this larger so someone can read this. The quote by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Let's see. Carol, do you want to read that? Would you like to unmute and read that quote of Heschel?
Where do you want me to start? The insights?
Insights, yeah.
The insights of wonder must be constantly kept alive. Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is a need for daily worship. This is one of the goals of the Jewish way of living. No experience commonplace deeds as spiritual adventures, to feel the hidden love and the wisdom of all things.
So that is the purpose of saying these blessings. Now, it's not to say you wouldn't feel these things in your heart anyway. Many of us, when we see something spectacular, something that's breathtaking, whether it's a garden or it's a sunset that's magnificent, or we woke up early enough one morning on purpose or by accident and saw this magnificent sunrise. Maybe it was the sunrise that woke us up because we fell asleep with the window shades open. The fact that we pause and think about saying a blessing, again, even if you don't remember the exact words, but you know there is such a blessing, and oh, maybe I'll look it up later, but I know that there's something here. The whole purpose is to experience commonplace deeds as spiritual adventures, to highlight, to make everything feel wondrous, even if you don't always feel wondrous inside. By saying it can make it so. So here are just a variety of examples of blessings that serve this purpose. And maybe if you see them in these more unusual situations, it can enable you to understand the food blessings and appreciate the food blessings even more so. So here, upon seeing the wonders of nature, lightning, shooting stars, vast deserts, high mountains, a spectacular sunrise or sunset, there is a blessing. It's Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam oseh ma'aseh bereshit. Praised are you, Adonai, our God who rules the universe, renewing the work of creation. Okay. Then there's also a specific blessing for seeing a storm or hearing thunder. This is also the blessing that one says in an earthquake. Right? So an earthquake's not a good thing, but there's even a blessing for bad stuff. Just how when, God forbid, someone dies and we say, Baruch Atah Dayan ha'emet, Baruch Dayan ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. There's also a blessing for earthquakes. Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam shekocho ugvurato maleh olam. This blessing is emphasizing God's power and might fill the universe. And then this is my favorite, probably the most often said blessing. It's the one that I always remember because it's a blessing just for a rainbow, so I don't have to remember the whole category. And it harkens back to a biblical story. Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam zocher habrit v'ne'emam bivrito v'kayam b'ma'amaro. Will somebody read that in English? Janet, would you like to read this one in English, the rainbow blessing?
Praised are you, Adonai, our God, who rules the universe, faithfully recalling the covenant by keeping the divine promise.
Okay, so that word covenant in Hebrew, brit, we have it twice here. It's brit, zocher habrit, and there's also bivrito. So in the transliteration, brit, right here, and bivrito, vrito or brito is the same. It's whether the bet has the dagesh, the dot in it or not. So here, bivrito, this bet does not have a dagesh in it, and this word brit does. What brit are we talking about here? What is being referenced? What biblical story is being referenced here?
Noah.
Yeah. So there was a covenant that was made then, right? And the covenant was a promise by God. And what did God say to Noah? God said,
Creator.
Yeah, what did God?
A sign.
Yeah, it's a sign. And with that sign came a promise. I will never destroy the world again. I will never bring food. I would never bring flood to this earth again to destroy the world. And that's God's word. And every time we see a rainbow, we're reminded of that blessing, of that covenant, of that promise. And then we make this blessing, Zocher Habrit. Zocher, by the way, recalling the covenant. What other Hebrew words do you know that are connected to the word Zocher? Any?
Yisker.
Yizkor, Zichrono, right? Zecher, like Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, all of those words. So Yizkor, the reason the memorial service is called Yizkor is because one of the paragraphs that we say as part of the individualized part of Yizkor is we're saying, God, may you remember. We want you to remember my loved one. And then you say the name of your loved one. Okay, let's go to a few more before we wrap up here.
Rabbi, where in the daily prayer book in the Sim Shalom is the Yizkor prayer? I looked for it, I couldn't find it.
I don't think Yizkor is in the daily prayer service. I think it's only in the holiday prayer service. So do you have Siddur Lev Shalem at home?
No, I do not.
Okay, maybe what I can do is I can send out whatchamacallit, PDF of it. I can send up something for your computer screen.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for doing that.
I know the Mourner's Kaddish is here, but not the Yizkor prayer itself.
Not right. Yizkor is not, because Yizkor is only done on holidays. So yeah, I will find a copy of that and send it out.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's just look at a few more blessings before we say goodbye. And Lahitraot. So this should be something we might be able to say shortly, or already in one part of my garden seems to be blooming here. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam shelo chisar be'olamo davar uvarav briot tovot v'ilanot tovim lahanot bahem b'nei adam. So we're praising God who lacks nothing. For God created fine creatures and pleasant trees in order that humans might enjoy them. And here's some others. I'm not going to read the blessings, but you can see them. Seeing creatures or vegetation of striking beauty, seeing unusual creatures, seeing a friend who has recovered from a serious illness, smelling fragrant spices, smelling the fragrance of trees or shrubs, smelling the fragrance of herbs or plants, smelling fragrant fruits. Some of these are things we say during Havdalah. This is the one that I am going to end with, is this blessing. Talk about heightening awareness after this year of pandemic and separation from each other. This blessing, upon seeing a friend after a year's absence. Yes, there is a blessing for this. So I don't know if you want to count Zoom as seeing people or not, but perhaps when you see someone for the first time that you haven't seen in a year, this is the blessing that you say. And it's the same blessing that's in the Amidah, the second blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam mechayeh hametim. So we are acknowledging God, we're praising God, we're blessing God, the ruler of the universe, for bringing the dead back to life, is what the literal words mechayeh, metim, means. You may have heard in Yiddish the word mechaya, right? It's such a mechaya, right? A mechaya, something that gives you life. Mechayeh hametim. There happens to be much more, I guess, polite translations of mechayeh hametim. In the context of the Amidah, we often will have the translation of mechayeh hametim as something that doesn't use the word resurrection. Like if you go into an Orthodox Siddur, you might find God who resurrects the dead and brings them back to life. I forget what the translation is in our Siddur Sim Shalom. Maybe we can look it up later while davening, but it's almost always something that's not a literal translation of restoring life. Restoring life doesn't only have to mean someone who literally was dead and who got resurrected in a resurrection physical kind of way. It could be spiritual resurrection. It could be, haven't seen you for a while in person, and now it's as if you've come back to life before my very eyes. So I wanted to leave you with that, and hope we'll all be able to say this bracha with each other soon. Bimhei Rabbi Aminu. And I will open up for questions and comments, and I'm going to pull up a mourner's Kaddish so that those who are saying Kaddish can say Kaddish. Okay, so you can unmute yourselves while I look for my Kaddish here.
Yeah. Maybe have some people say.
There's a few that